pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to talk about this subject, and I hope that you are all people that will be able to sort of foment an interest in mobilizing our church to be the church as they're scattered out in the world. If God didn't care about work and Redeemer in New York City didn't value it, I don't think I would have ever given Christianity a second look. I was a business school grad, I'd worked in aerospace, and I'd been a consultant and then worked in sales and marketing in the high-tech sector, and my identity was in my work. What I'd achieved in my work distinguished me from those that I wanted to feel as good as or better than. My work accomplishments made up for the fact that I wasn't yet married. The challenges of work gave me something to engage my brain and my spirit, and the fact that I worked in high tech made me feel like I was contributing something of infinite value to the world, satellite systems or hardware, software tools. And in contrast, the church as I understood it seemed lackluster, devoid of vision, devoid of impact. I do believe God called Tim Keller to New York City to plant Redeemer just for me. One of my staff invited me to attend again and again and again before I finally went. But when I went, I heard a vision that competed with even the best of my high-tech world claims that the gospel changes everything. The gospel, through God's church, can change, renew, transform New York City, and I was being invited to be part of it. I was invited into a vision, into meaning, into hope, into a community of people who are also excited about that vision. Today, I truly believe that inviting people who don't know God into His work in the world is a huge untapped potential for evangelism. So I just want to recap the morning a little bit. Gideon talked about God's plan for work, to care for creation and cultivate it, to create culture that brings shalom to all people, to bring order out of chaos and serve others. Drew talked about the problem of work, how it's broken by the fall, becomes fruitless and pointless and selfish. As a matter of fact, I describe work as an idol factory. It's a place where you go to really find out your idols of control and comfort and pleasure and power and privilege and really feed them. And then lastly, Rankin talked about the gospel's solution for our work, that the gospel helps us recover the original intent of work and a vision for shalom. It gives us a new audience in God for our work, and it gives us a new power for work. So it just so happens that those are the three sections of the book that I worked on with Tim Keller, and if you want to read more depth of that, the solution, it's right there. My hope in all the ministry I'm doing is that all Christians would live their lives deep into that storyline because the gospel changes everything. So 13 years ago, I'm going to talk about now how we apply that storyline of work in everyday ministry in the congregation in New York. 13 years ago, when I was invited to move back to New York, I'd been in the Bay Area, to start this marketplace ministry, I really had a blank sheet of paper. I had a chance to create whatever might have some impact. I knew the support I wished I'd had in those prior 10 years of being a Christian in the marketplace, but I couldn't create the whole ministry just for me. I experimented with classes and panel discussions, and I got some sense of what people wanted. Now, note our congregation's an interesting mix of new to the faith and raised in the faith, as well as about 50% Asian and 50% white and other. But pretty much everyone has been privileged by an education, and some even by a profession. So, of course, my needs assessment and my ministry somewhat reflects that. But I believe this theology, these principles of faith and work need to be the same whether you're in 2 centuries ago or 1 century ahead from now, whether you're in an African continent or this continent. So hopefully you'll be able to apply these to your own context. But what I heard was, when I talked with people and would do these classes, was everyone wanted the rules. They wanted to know what they should and shouldn't do at work. They wanted ethics. They also sort of wanted to talk about evangelism. I mean, some had been fairly trained in their church and they were feeling pretty guilty that they weren't doing it. And some just wanted prayer. They wanted a support group. And of course, everyone wanted to talk about their calling. Actually, it seems that what people want falls loosely into the categories that a scholar and leader, David Miller, created to describe the various kinds of ministries that are out there in the faith and work arena. He did a whole survey of faith and work ministries over the last 50 years and wrote about it in his book, God at Work. So I'm going to use his 4 categories today and actually try to help you visualize them with me. He placed them in a 4-square matrix, each one starting with the letter E, which makes it easier to remember. So his 4 categories were ethics, evangelism, enrichment, and experience. Now, I used experience for the idea of calling because he needed an E, so we'll just give him some grace for that word. When our people talked about what they thought they needed to better live out their faith, these are the things they talked about. I also think as we go deeper into the gospel and deeper into the storyline, it really explodes these areas, and I want to talk about that as well. So I'm going to go through each of them and talk about what our churches seem to think it is and what it actually could be in all of our churches in our cities. So the first one, ethics, the top left corner. This is the theme of most business persons' faith and work conversation. How do you be a good, virtuous person at work? At CFW, we started 18 different vocation groups by, our groups by vocation. And many of them, the conversations were about ethics. The lawyers wanted to know, if their boss, who was Jewish, wanted them to work on Sunday, should they? The business people wanted to talk about the pressure to fudge on their sales forecasts. The actors wanted to know if it was okay to take off their clothes to play a part in the play. As a matter of fact, the only sermon I ever heard about work when I was a tech CEO in Northern California was about how I should make sure I leave work every day right around 5 or 5:30 so I could have dinner with my family. Another rule, never mind that I was single and had no family to have dinner with. I was so pummeled for rules about what a Christian should or shouldn't do that I got worried. Not that ethics aren't a concern in our culture, they are. Even for Christians, we could all use a refresher on how we might be tempted to lie, cheat, covet, and hurt others. But even the Old Testament is more about a relationship with God and wisdom that comes from that relationship than it's concerned about the rules. And the gospel is so much more than even that. I had to actually stop answering questions about rules or even best practices in order to force people into a deeper engagement with God. So what I've seen and what I still want to see is a move from a focus on rules to a wisdom that comes from knowing God. A focus on staying within the law to a heart for transparency and full disclosure. Less concern with appearances to more focus on the content, for example, of the play itself and its message of truth and redemption. But even more than that, I'd like us to expand the ethics category, which is typically centered around being an honest person, to include justice. The ethics-oriented people of faith are often engaged in some acts of mercy, maybe outside of their work, but rarely in thinking about the justice of their everyday workplace. And justice ministry starts in our everyday lives, and particularly in our work. God's plan is that all people made in his image should have the opportunity to experience the dignity of good work well done. In our broken worlds, that dignity is very maligned. So the hierarchies, the who's at the top and who's at the bottom, are clearly defined. And even in the church, we find a huge diminishing of human dignity as you go down that hierarchical chain. I think we can encourage our people to push against injustice in the workplace when we advocate for the career growth of women and minorities, when we share the vision and goals of the organization with everybody that's involved so they feel this sense of common purpose, and when we push down the decision making so that others get to experience the responsibility of that. I mean, I'd grown up with the leadership wisdom of how important delegation was, but when it came right down to it, and I had to delegate, I often felt like, well, I would delegate to that person if they just had a little more experience or a little more wisdom like I do. And one of my favorite stories is from Dennis Bakke, who founded a very large energy company, and delegating to employees down the sort of hierarchical layers was really an important mission of his. He wrote it in a book, Joy at Work. And I'm listening to this and thinking, delegation, it's so hard. But I got a chance to talk to him, and I said, so Dennis, how do you really do this? How do you delegate to someone who in fact would not make as good a decision as you do? And he said, well, look at Genesis 1 and 2. God delegated. And there is no way in the world he thought we were going to make as good a decision with the creation that he had made as he would. But he delegated so that we would experience that dignity of being human. And just that connection really has, I don't think there's a time that I've been reluctant to delegate that I haven't thought of that story and attempted to give the decision away because of the dignity that gives the decision maker. So ethics, a pursuit of justice for all people, and creating a culture that wants to pursue that justice for the whole organization. Number 2, evangelism. I'm the product of evangelism in the workplace, so this is a very important area to me. God used one of my colleagues to get me to church. But I don't think our current evangelism approaches are bearing much fruit, at least what I get to see. Most of the people I work with seem to know they should evangelize, and a few of them even want to, but they struggle with it. And so I want to just talk about 2 reasons I think there's a struggle with evangelism. One is, I think our churches sometimes encourage us to use work to evangelize. In other words, the work itself isn't important. It's just the conversions that might potentially come out of it. And I think that poses a little bit of a moral dilemma for people in the workforce. They know they're getting paid to produce good, excellent, quality work for the good of the organization. So just to be using it to do evangelism seems a bit of a disconnect. And secondly, I think our approach to evangelism precedes this contemporary culture where we're not in Christendom anymore, where there's far more antagonism to people of faith, to the ideas of faith, and sometimes in some of our industries, even hostility. So what do we need to do? I think we have to be really rigorous about honoring the work itself, and that in itself glorifies God. I do believe when we honor the work itself and we do it excellently, with joy, with perseverance, with hope, that does invite questions. It invites curiosity. It gives us the chance to give a reason for the hope that is in us. And I'm happy to say I've seen our people get those kind of questions more and more frequently. As a matter of fact, I would love to see us practice giving that kind of testimony first to each other so that we can do it then with people who don't know Christ. I think we spend far too much time on that initial testimony of conversion and not enough time just talking amongst ourselves about what the gospel changed in us this week. How did the gospel change me from someone who was just bitter and spiteful against the colleague that inched his way ahead of me into being able to actually love him because I was actually able to work it through with God and let the gospel change me. So I'd love to see us get more and more comfortable sharing those testimonies amongst ourselves, and I think we'd be far more ready to explain that hope that's within us when we get the question outside. And secondly, at Redeemer, we talk about how our discipleship has been more of a discipleship for Jerusalem instead of Babylon. How can we prepare people for an environment that's much more like Babylon was, where our witness is a whole life witness, not necessarily just bringing other people in Jerusalem back into church who've maybe fallen away for a decade or so. So we use the term exilic discipleship. Much harder preparation, much more equipping, but I think we need to do that. And I think we need to give our people places and programs where they can invite their colleagues in, and conversations about work, meaning of work, finding the work that's right for you. All those kinds of conversations are really great opportunities for people to invite their colleagues in for a little introductory conversation to what the riches of the gospel are. So we've talked about ethics and evangelism. My third category is enrichment, or nurture the faith. And I really first started thinking about this when I was in Northern California, and a lot of my staff would go away for a TM weekend or some other sort of what I think they would have called a sort of new age spirituality kind of refreshment. And they would come back refreshed, ready to go to work. And I think about the people in my church and think, they might be going back to work on Monday morning exhausted. We've just worked the heck out of them all weekend, volunteering inside the church. What do we need to do? We have far more resources than any other worldview or faith to help people start Monday morning refreshed and renewed and filled up with God's strength and power. What do we need to do to really be centers of enrichment for our people? I think a concept of our church as a base camp, a place where people can come in and replenish their supplies, renew their strength, clarify their mission, is a really good picture for us. And maybe we can organize things on Sunday that would really help them get that sense of renewal. But I also think we need to deepen spiritual practices. I've got a lot of smart people. Some of them try to read the Bible, some of them try to have regular times of prayer. But quite frankly, I think they don't do it because they're not getting much out of it. And in some ways, I think sometimes I think they've never experienced prayer as something more than a litany of their petitions for help. And so we've spent a lot of time really trying to deepen the practice of prayer and the practice of Bible reading. And if they've done nothing else, then get a sense that it does really enrich them and refresh them. I think we're making real progress. We all want a faith that renews us. I want to see God change me. I want to know that He's working on me. I want to see God change others around me, and I want to see God at work in the world. And so I think all of those, that ability to see that is amazingly renewing for us. And then fourth, in that last category of experience, I could run a class on calling every week of the year. And sometimes I think we do a disservice in that. We sort of, through all of our testing and our strengths finders and our, sort of find the right job for you, we create the impression that our calling, in fact, would be comfortable, pleasurable, resonate with all of our gifts. And in fact, I don't think there's a lot of theological truth to that. I think we're often called to places of extraordinary discomfort, like standing in front of a group and having to give a talk like this. And we really need to give an understanding of calling that's so much broader than just feeling good about our work for ourselves. As a matter of fact, I think it pulls us into the identity idol that Drew talked about. where our identity is really fractured because it gets mixed up with the prestige of our work or the easiness of our work. We get a paycheck for that easy job, that's amazing. Or the respectability, or in the church, the goodness of our work. And all of those things are detracting from our identity as children of God, children adopted by God and loved by God. So I think we have to be really careful how we talk about calling. On top of that, I think even in our secular institutions, people are being trained for jobs today that will be gone tomorrow. So there's an extraordinary dis-ease in our workplace that is affecting everyone, which again opens it up for people who don't know God to come in and learn what we have to say, what our antidote to that dis-ease is. But I think at the root, it's a lack of a picture of God's work, a lack of seeing God at work, sustaining the universe, and even moving us ever so slightly towards shalom, or human flourishing. 1 Corinthians 12 ends with a sentence, "And I will show you a more excellent way." And then chapter 13 picks it up with, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." Connecting those two, the more excellent way is a way of love. And I think the meaning, the existential crisis that people are having, is that we've looked at work as something to serve us and not as an expression of love. Loving and being loved is what gives our lives meaning. Whether we're showing our love through the product we help make or the service that we give, experiencing meaning is a result of giving ourselves in love. And as Rankin said earlier, love means sacrifice, dying to ourselves and our own self-manufactured identity for the love of others. So in summary, we connect our work to God's work when we have a deep sense of calling to our little part of God's bigger care for the world. I loved Albert Tate's illustration or elaboration on the loaves and the fishes story yesterday. Our ability to bring one tiny little loaf and let Jesus work with it gives us, seeing that as part of our calling, part of our part of God's bigger care for the world, is really the answer to that lack of meaning, that need for meaning in our work. We'll connect our work to God's work when we're renewed by the resources of our faith. When we live it out in a way that's winsome and therefore witness, and when we push against the results of sin in some way by being doers or advocates of justice in our everyday work environments, as well as living lives of integrity, not so much to earn our way to heaven, but for the sake of others. So my last point, we really can't do this in our own strength. We are sinners saved by grace, and we will blow it all the time. But the gospel does change us. Every time we die to our own idol and let God give us a rebirth in his purposes for our lives, every time we repent and experience grace, every time we acknowledge our own sin and brokenness, that change, that gospel change process begins. So our mantra at the Center for Faith and Work and at Redeemer is that the gospel does change everything. It changes our hearts, it changes our community, and then it changes the world if we have eyes to look and to see. So I thank you for this time to talk to you. Let me just close us in a prayer.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.